provisionally called this talk something like Dharma Practice in a Time of Climate Crisis, Where to from here? I don't know how many people have heard the news today to do with the Adani coal mine, but the groundwater plan was approved by the Queensland government. So that's the last regulatory hurdle standing in the way of that very large coal mine. So where to from here is very much on my mind at the moment, because I work as a climate change activist for a multi-faith climate organisation called the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. The image that comes to my mind is that of maybe a small town. Imagine a small town sometime, long time ago, with a very, very slow spreading fire that actually threatens every single building in the town. Doesn't threaten it straight away, but everyone knows the fire is spreading. And in that town there's a community of Buddhist monks, let's say. And they've been working on setting up a monastery and teaching people the Dharma. How do they respond? That's the image, I think, that simplifies it for me. The climate crisis is actually quite literally heating up. Every day we get a sort of scary new report, it seems. And so my question is, how can we as aspiring or practicing Buddhists best respond? It's probably worth spending a minute or so just kind of recapping the current situation when it comes to the climate at the moment. There was a big report that came out from the UN last year that said by the year 2030 we need to have made some very major changes, or really there's going to be some very serious consequences. That's the short version. Scientists are now, and even military people are now talking in terms of the risk of the collapse of civilization. I think that's probably, enough information on that. We're talking, large parts of the world potentially becoming uninhabitable, and perhaps hundreds of millions or even billions of refugees. And everything that follows from that. Disease, fire, flood, drought, etc. And so what's needed is a really rapid transformation. And in broad terms, even the UN's body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they say we need to halve worldwide emissions from coal, oil and gas by the year 2030. And they're usually slightly conservative, actually, the IPCC. So it's probably more than that. And here in Australia, we're the world's biggest coal exporter. And coal actually needs to be reduced, according even to the IPCC, by somewhere between 60 and 80% by the year 2030. So, and it's probably more than that. So, it's a tough gig, folks. So, how is this part of practicing the Buddhist path, practicing the Dharma? Because the Buddha's response the Buddha's teaching was a response to the reality of suffering. His response to the reality of suffering, though, was a very particular one. It was the liberation of consciousness from all sense of a sort of fixed me, a sort of free from all greed, from hatred, from ignorance of deep interconnectedness. To put it, there's a lot of ways of describing what his enlightenment experience was. I can't claim to have got there, so I've just put it in sort of simple terms like that. But breaking down the barrier between the sense of self and other, the sense of what equals me is really is much less fixed than we usually imagine. But there are other traditions that have had a response to suffering. You could say that from what I can work out, the Christian tradition is one that says, well, what you need to do is bear the cross of suffering, and love your neighbours in the process and love God in the process. But it doesn't talk about transforming consciousness, as far as I can see. Maybe there's mystical Christian traditions that I don't know about. But what that means is the Buddhist sense of ethics is really quite different from, say, at its core, to, say, Christian ethics. And a sense of ethics is Buddhist sense of ethics is based on states of mind, transforming consciousness. It's not about just the well-being of the group, valuable as that is, or even the fear of punishment. It's probably worth just reading the very first 2 verses of the Dhammapada. I'm not, by the way, trying to present anything new here tonight. This is extremely basic Dharma. But it is an attempt to sort of work out what that means in the current context. So this is the first 2 verses of the most famous 2 verses of probably the most famous Buddhist text. And it's extremely practical and down to earth. It starts off, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs. So there's this really strong emphasis on states of mind, purifying states of mind, and saying, well, actually, that is the thing on which it has the strongest determining effect on consequences and happiness, which is a very big statement indeed, if you think about it. So one question that comes to my mind is, because I work with a lot of climate activists from different organisations, how can something like a climate movement expect to create a positive world if people who are active in that world, activists, pay only a rudimentary attention to their mental states, just to be blunt? This is, and another question that goes along with that is, can we as a community provide meditation and Dharma teaching to activists, those ones who are interested in that? At the very least, it might help them relax. And I know I need that. I went to the gym. I joined a gym for the first time a few weeks ago, and they put me on this machine and they measured your body fat. And one of the things they've discovered was that my visceral body fat, which is the fat on your organs, was slightly higher than average, or than it should be. And that's stress-induced. That's not what you eat. And I thought, gosh, 20 years of Dharma practice, but ain't no match for working as a climate activist just yet. And when it comes to taking responsibility for one's own states of mind, the Buddhist tradition is incredibly uncompromising. There is this text called the Parable of the Saw from the Pali Canon. It says, well, your states of mind are always your responsibility. Now, and there's this very hyperbolic way of putting it in this particular text, but there's this description of where the Buddha is saying to his disciples, suppose you were laid upon by, I'm summarising here, by highway bandits, and suppose they took out a double-handed saw and they started cutting off your limbs. If one thought of hate arises in your mind, you're no disciple of mine. Think about that. Just, how easy it is to get irritated with your housemate just because they didn't do the washing up. So it's not actually saying, it's a very, very tall order, but for us in this situation, it's very easy out of fear to get into hatred. And I know I've fallen into that mistake. I was fortunate enough to be part of a religious delegation to meet Josh Frydenberg when he was the Minister for the Environment and Energy. And there was like a bishop and a rabbi and a nun and me. And it sounded like the beginning of a really bad joke. But we all walked in and met Frydenberg. And I said to the others beforehand, it was my clear determination, I wanted to go in there and have compassion for him. That was what the task I set myself on. I utterly failed. It didn't take very long at all before I was really quite angry. And so I know how hard that ask actually is. But let's be clear about what positive states of mind actually mean in the Buddhist tradition. It's not about just feeling nice. So there's a distinction between what's called Vedana, which is kind of feeling tone, which is relatively a passive thing. It's like, oh yeah, I feel good, I feel bad. And Chaitana, which means directionality of mind or will, what you're doing with your mind. Yeah. Now that creates consequences, because that determines how you speak and how you act. So that is having a positive Chaitana that is the point in Buddhism. So the classic list that the Abhidharma tradition lists in terms of positive states of mind. I'll just rattle through the list of 11. And by the way, the Abhidharma lists 51 states of mind. I'm sure there are more, it's just one way of classifying it. Only 11 of them are positive. But they are confidence and trust, at least in something. Something more than yourself, I guess. Self-respect or healthy regret when you do something unethical. Respect for wise opinion. Contentment, clarity, alert tranquility, ethical vigilance, goodwill, compassion, equanimity, and the energetic determination for the good. Those are healthy, positive states of mind. So that's what we're talking about. And what I'm suggesting is that we really need a climate movement, and that is informed by a real understanding of how you work with those states of mind. And more to the point, if we as Buddhists are going to get involved in climate action, we need to pay very close attention to those, as well as to the negative states of mind, because it's very easy to get into negative states of mind. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but do get involved in the action, but it does mean it raises a real challenge. Now, our teacher, Sangharakshita Bhante, did actually speak about the need for urgent action under some circumstances, and for Buddhists to get very, very involved indeed in social action under some circumstances. He gave us a talk, I think it was the late 70s, someone else might be able to correct me, called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War. Now at that stage, of course, people were worried very, very much about the threat of nuclear war, as I think we still should be. And he was saying, actually, Buddhists really need to get heavily involved in doing whatever was necessary to stop that. And let me just quote what he said, one part of that. He said, what's needed is persistent lobbying of members of parliament, by the presentations of petitions, by public meetings, marches and demonstrations, by fasts and solemn vigils, even by love-ins and be-ins, it was the 70s. By these and similar means, the government should be left in no doubt as to what the wishes of the electorate really are. And if it remains unresponsive to those wishes, or not sufficiently responsive, and the situation is one of extreme urgency where every day is precious, then more serious measures should be taken and pressure brought to bear on the government by means of mass civil disobedience along Gandhian lines. So that's putting it pretty clearly, isn't it? Now, he went on to talk, later on in that talk, it's worth pointing out, that he went on to say that actually we need to go beyond something like preventing nuclear war, wherein I think the obvious parallel here, preventing climate catastrophe. He said it would be the greatest shame if all that happened was, if the greatest vision was survival and then going back and watching a really awful television. He said you're still left with the basic problem called the human condition. And we still need an answer to that. So there's an awful lot more that he would advocate, that he did advocate. So to come back to the image of the monks in the village and how they respond to the fire. Well, if you think about it, mind and world condition one another, yeah? There's a reason why we don't teach meditation for the first time in the middle of the M8 motorway. It's not very good conditions for teaching meditation, right? We have a nice Buddhist centre. We have we have a tea urn, we have adequate heating, we hope. We try to we have a nice aesthetic space with images of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas on the walls. So that's the world conditioning the mind. It works the other way around. The mind conditions the world. If you act or speak in with a pure or impure mind, as we've heard, it has consequences. Yeah. So, what Buddhists are trying to do is break down the wall between the mind and the world, see more clearly how they condition one another, and how this idea of a self is really a bit of a myth. So those monks in the village, how would they respond to the fire? Well, how should they if they were... Well, put it this way. What do you think is a more egoistic response? To say, get heavily involved and say, I'm going to go out there and do something and try and put the fire out? Or to say, oh, I need to go and practice the Dharma and sit in my Buddhist centre, and I'm not going to get involved because that would be a bit worldly. So, personally, I think the latter response would be a much more egoistical response. Draw your conclusions for the current context. Another image for that, which I quite like, is as Buddhists we're trying to defuse the bomb of the ego. That goes, so we need to do that. There's a reason why we need to not just prevent climate catastrophe, even though that's a good thing, an incredibly useful and necessary thing. There are all sorts of other awful problems that the world is currently facing. I went away on a solitary retreat once and read this book on 21st century problems, about 10 of them. I was thinking to myself, God, you take kind of cheerful things on retreat, don't you, Tejopala? And the common characteristic of all of these things, one of them was that they're all extremely complex. And therefore, if they're extremely complex, they all require a high degree of cooperation. But a high degree of cooperation also requires one other thing, which is getting your ego out of the way. A lot of people doing that. And so, I always think about, because I grew up as a teenager in the 80s, and I always think about the sort of the idea of nuclear disarmament that was going on then. I kind of think what we are is people involved in the ego disarmament movement, essentially. But there are ways in which this crisis can make Dhamma practice harder. I mean, I used to do this test. There's a thing called there's a mental state called prapancha, which is just a technical term meaning proliferation of mental events. Yeah. So you think of something and it sparks off another thought, sparks off another thought. 3 thoughts collide into each other, make 8,000 thoughts. That's prapancha. And it kind of gets in the way of stillness and being able to see deeply into the nature of reality. So I used to have this test for prapancha. This test doesn't work outside of Australia, but it works beautifully in Australia. And it goes like this. Think of these 2 words. Tony Abbott. Just see what happened to your mind at that moment. It's just, hundreds of associations all come to your mind, and probably not all of them positive. It can be stressful. You can get into stressed out states of mind doing something about the climate. I've heard of one order member who says that sometimes it's possible to treat the news like a kind of pornography. You get your hit of news. There's the danger of getting into hate. And there's another subtle danger which is hard to describe, which is getting into sort of activism, if you're a Buddhist, runs the risk that all you're doing, I certainly know this, all you're doing but it's kind of good stuff, but it kind of flattens your experience out into kind of a mere humanism rather than having a transcendent quality to it. Now, that matters because a humanistic response is really good and worthwhile, but it's ultimately very stifling for the human condition. People need more than that, I think. And so how do you respond to that? Well, how do you deal with the fact that those things can get in the way and make Dharma practice harder if you do get involved? Well, one practical thing to bear in mind is that as conditions get worse over the coming years, and assuming that they'll at least get a little bit worse, even if we do a very good job, we're certainly going to need sincerely practicing Dharma practitioners and an effective community of Dharma practitioners. We're going to need more and more people who are working on transforming their minds. We're going to need to be better at helping others to transform their minds. We're going to need more and more an effective community of real friends. Yet clearly that's not enough by itself. If that were, I would put all my life energy into just building a Buddhist community. The problem is, I don't think we're going to change. We're going to create that scale of a Buddhist community in the next 11 years, in the time that we've actually got to make some really big changes. I wish I could put all my life into building a Buddhist community. I would like nothing more. So I've got some suggestions about how we might work with this, as how we might bring this onto the path. So, first of all, I've got some suggestions in terms of mental states, and I've got some suggestions in terms of practical actions, and I hope they're related. So, in our community, we tend to talk of a system of practice. We talk about the 5 aspects of practice: integration, positive emotion, what we call spiritual death, which always sounds like a heavy metal band to me. Spiritual rebirth, which sounds like a Christian anyway. Spiritual rebirth and spiritual receptivity. So integration. Well, first of all, admitting the scale and urgency of the problem, at least to ourselves. And whatever we do, acting ethically, following the precepts. One of the precepts is truthful speech, and I think one of the most important things is to actually speak the truth about the climate situation that we're in. This is an emergency, and it's the likes of which the world has never seen before. It's also important to speak kindly. It's another of the Buddhist precepts. Integration also includes acting in a way that's actually commensurate with the problem. I don't know if I've used to work in energy efficiency for government, for funded programs, and I kind of got tired of hearing government ministers go out there and saying, this is the greatest problem the world's ever seen. Here, have an energy-saving light bulb. It just kind of, there was this weird cognitive disconnect. So actually doing things that are commensurate with the problem, that's a part of integration. And taking care to limit prapancha, to limit the unnecessary proliferation of mental states. Then there's positive emotion. And I think about all the difficult emotions that come up when it comes to the climate problem, fear has got to be the worst. So I've been looking around for, well, what did the Buddha say about how you deal with fear? And there is this really well-known text where he talks about fear and dread. If you imagine 2,500 years ago, they were wandering forest monks here in ancient India. They didn't live in monasteries, so often they were in the jungle in the middle of the night, or just in the jungle generally, but at night, sometimes by themselves. And so there was real danger in that situation. Animals, robbers who may come by, who knows what. And so not only was there a real threat, there was just the danger of the mind just running riot with fear. So I'll just read you a little bit about what the Buddha said about facing fear in that situation. It is not easy to endure isolated forest or wilderness dwellings. It's not easy to maintain seclusion, not easy to enjoy being alone. The forests, as it were, plunder the mind of a monk who has not yet attained concentration. Before my awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, the thought occurred to me as well, it is not easy to endure isolated forest wilderness dwellings. It is not easy to maintain seclusion, not easy to enjoy being alone. The forests, as it were, plunder the mind of a monk who has not attained concentration. The thought occurred to me, when Brahmins or contemplatives who are unpurified in their bodily activities resort to isolated forest or wilderness dwellings, it is the fault of their unpurified bodily activities that they give rise to unskillful fear and terror. But it is not the case that I am unpurified in my bodily activities when I resort to isolated forest or wilderness dwellings. I am purified in my bodily activities. I am one of those noble ones who are purified in their bodily activities when they resort to isolated forest or wilderness dwellings. Seeing in myself this purity of bodily activities, I feel even more undaunted about staying in the wilderness. And he goes on to repeat that because the Pali Canon does a lot of repetition. He goes on to repeat that in terms of verbal activities and mental activities and all aspects of the Eightfold Buddhist path. So he's talking about purifying his ethics, purifying his states of mind, and saying that if you acknowledge the feelings of fear, and if you know that you are someone who has for a long time has acted ethically and has purified their mind by doing so, in itself that won't stop nasty creatures from leaping out of the jungles and eating you, but you will have a kind of emotional and psychic armour because you will feel so grounded in yourself from having acted like that and for such a long time. So I think one answer to fear in this situation is just to be a lot more ethical. It won't solve the problem, but it will help us keep our feet on the ground. Then there's what's called the Karuna Bhavana. You would be familiar with the Metta Bhavana, the loving kindness meditation. There's actually, some of you may well know this, there are 4 variations of that. The Karuna Bhavana is one of the 4 sub-variations. Karuna simply means compassion. So you're developing not just loving kindness, but compassion, which is what happens when loving kindness meets suffering. So the reason I'm mentioning that is that the opposite of karuna, or compassion, is said to be cruelty. Yeah, that's called its far enemy. The direct opposite, its enemy of compassion is cruelty. But there's another couple of enemies of compassion. They're called the near enemy. And they look like compassion, but they're not. And one of them is overwhelmed, horrified anxiety. Now, I can't think of a better description of how I feel sometimes when it comes to the climate problem. And if anyone who really takes in the facts will feel that way, unless they're so seriously well developed spiritually. So the idea of the Karuna Bhavana is it moves your mind in the opposite direction. And so the antidote to horrified, overwhelmed anxiety is to cultivate compassion. There's other obvious things. The mindfulness of breathing is classically said to be the thing that lowers your anxiety. There's working with friends and acting on it together. There's getting out into the country and just taking a break. There's having loving kindness or cultivating loving kindness for those whom we are opposing. The other image that comes to mind as I say that is the other meeting I had, apart from meeting Freidenberg, was a group of us met with the entire executive leadership team of the Adani Corporation in Australia about a year ago, and boy, was that a tough one in terms of keeping some loving kindness going. Remaining aware at all, even if you're not actually able to cultivate loving kindness, just remaining aware of your states of mind. And for that, the best book I've read personally is a book by a member of our order called Subhuti, called Mind in Harmony. It is just such a good practical guide to recognising and acknowledging your states of mind. There's cultivating reverence and faith, by doing things like pujas, devotional rituals. Incidentally, one of the things I've noticed in the sort of nearly 2 years I've been doing this work for this multi-faith organisation is the effect that it has on other people who are who don't consider themselves in any way spiritual or religious, but who are involved in the climate movement, the effect it has when people who are religious in some sense get out there and do something. A lot of people have been a lot more moved by that than I've expected. And, when you get someone like, I don't know, a rabbi saying, I'm willing to be arrested over this, it has quite an effect. And I've noticed that it actually gives much needed faith, for want of a better word, a very loaded and difficult word, to people who very often don't quite have much they have confidence in at all. And understandably so. When it comes to spiritual death, there's just time sitting still. It's probably the thing that activists do the least. And there's confession, like just owning up to your own ethical shortcomings. When it comes to spiritual rebirth, well, why not? I mean, we need the arts and we need artists. That's a pretty good way to motivate, to cultivate that side. There's order members doing what we call our sadhana practice, which is the visualization of a bodhisattva or Buddha, and the mantra associated with that bodhisattva or Buddha, to keep us inspired in everything we're doing, whether it's to do with happening to be responding to the climate situation, because that's the current big problem, or whatever it is we do. There's the image and the myth of what's called the bodhisattva, the being who works for the benefit of all beings, for the liberation of the consciousness, the mind and heart of all beings. I think what we need, ultimately, when it comes to the political side of things, is what's called a Bodhisattva Institute. You have these think tanks. I think we should have one called the Bodhisattva Institute. I'm serious. And it should say, well, look, here's what moving towards, here's what the influence of Buddhist principles would have on society if we put them into practice. So down to actual brass tacks, practical steps we can take. I think as Buddhists we often have far more influence than we think. I've often spoken to people who say, yeah, well, what can I do? And, well, first of all, as the great American climate leader Bill McKibben said, well, the answer to that is that's the wrong question. The question should be, what can we do together? And when we come together as Buddhists and take a public stand on a moral issue, usually it doesn't get very much media attention for most people do that. But when people who are clearly have a spiritual tradition do that, it does. I mean, this obviously applies to those who would be perceived as a religious leader because they've got one of these things around their neck or something like that. But it can also apply even to small groups of people who would not be regarded as a leader. Say you get just 10 or 20 people meditating in the street as part of a protest outside of the offices of a member of parliament or a fossil fuel company. That creates a much bigger statement than 10 or 20 other people just standing there all protesting. I've seen this happen. I've seen photos of this in the UK where people have been outside Barclays Bank protesting about their funding fossil fuel companies. And they've had 5 Buddhists sitting there meditating. But it's noteworthy enough at least to get on social media and possibly into the media. I think Buddhists have a special role here as well, as we can lead meditation process, which is an interesting idea. And that can attract people who don't see themselves as Buddhist or religious in any sense. I saw this happen. We had a group of us protested outside of the office of the local MP just prior to the election. And most of the people who showed up were not Buddhists. They were 25 or 30 people, and only about 5 of them were from the centre. And some of them had never meditated before. But meaning that we can attract larger numbers of people than just within our own circles, doing something symbolically powerful, and which in itself implicitly communicates the notion that we need to work on changing the world and on the mind, as if they were different or separate. We might even attract adherents of other faith traditions, as we did at that day when we were joined by an 80-year-old Catholic nun friend of mine, Barbara, thus making the actions multi-faith and more compelling. I know that Buddhists are often prepared, increasingly so, to take bolder actions up to and including civil disobedience, and there's going to be some need for this in the wake of the announcement today here in Australia. More generally, there's going to be a worldwide strike, a worldwide general strike. I've never heard of one of those, on September the 20th this year. The climate activist Greta Thunberg from Sweden, 16-year-old schoolgirl, she's the one who said we need to do this, and quite a lot of people are joining in. I think there's room for a Buddhist involvement in things like that. Our potential for this kind of action is sometimes limited by the fact that there are only, say, 1 or 2 people at any one Buddhist centre who are passionate about this problem, and those people often feel isolated. The key thing is to get those people together to form a group with like-minded people and to start organising. Fortunately, we have such a group here at the Melbourne Buddhist Centre, so please do come and talk to me afterwards. We've also been organising recently within Triratna, within our Buddhist community worldwide. And there's a few suggestions I think I'd like to make about the sorts of things that we could do as a community worldwide. I think we could get involved in events that are designed to bring about societal change, such as, for those of you who've heard of it, Extinction Rebellion or something equivalent. Here in Australia, that obviously needs to include the Adani mine. Divestment, getting our money out of banks and shares and power companies that have anything to do with the fossil fuel industry. Starting with Buddhist centres. The Sydney Buddhist Centre, our sister centre up there, did that a couple of years ago. Actually got media attention. So I think that makes quite a big difference. Switching to green energy, putting solar on the roof, and there is a scheme actually called the Sustainable Buddhist Centre Certification Scheme. Might I suggest making the climate crisis a standing item on the Centre Committee's agenda? It comes up every month. Lobbying local elected members, like a member of parliament or a local municipality, to declare a climate emergency. Now, we don't need to do that here in the city of Moreland because they've actually already done that. But it's an important thing to do wherever possible. Providing free meditation outreach to climate activists who badly need it. But the main thing we need is organisers. I was lucky enough to train in a thing called the Community Organising Fellowship last year. And one sort of 3-word slogan they had, which I don't know if it came from the Bernie Sanders campaign or whether it was before that, was organisers, organise, organisers. First thing you do is you find other people who are willing to get involved in organising stuff. Ultimately, what I'm hoping we might achieve is something a bit like what we call in our Sangha in India a Dharma revolution. That is to say, a movement of people working together to transform both the mind and the world. And so I'm going to finish on... No, actually I was going to read this, but I actually would rather leave a bit more time for questions or discussions. We've only got 10 or 12 minutes. So I will leave the Shambhala Warrior Mind Training for another time. So that's it. I'm calling for a Dharma revolution. Sign up.